Hi, this is Viktor Gamov with Confluent, and in this module I will tell you what kind of APIs from Spring Kafka you can use to receive messages from Kafka topic in Confluent Cloud. Let's get to it. So the main component that drives all things inside the Spring Boot is obviously factories. And if we learned on the previous lesson that the producer factory will be responsible for instantiating Kafka producers, so in this case, consumer factory will be responsible for instantiated Kafka consumers in our application. So for that, as always, we need to provide the property files or like configurations that our consumer will be using. So in this case, we're creating a consumer properties bean, which is essentially the map that has a key pair with keys, some of the config parameters, value, obviously value. And after that, we need to create a bean, consumer factory bean that will take these parameters and will be responsible for instantiating new producers. Inside the Spring Boot, the many components that integrate with messaging systems follow the pattern of message-driven POJO. If you've been around the Java community for a while, you know that in Java EE specification or even Java 2EE specification, back in the day, they introduced message-driven beans as a part of Enterprise Java Bean specification. But it was something that's very cool as idea, but it was very difficult to use. It requires your application server in order to run this. And the good people from the Spring framework came with this idea of a simplified version of those beans. Should take this, not the Enterprise Java beans, but make them just a regular Java POJOs and make them like Spring managed beans. And that's where the concept of message-driven POJO comes into life. So message-driven POJO allows asynchronous communication between the systems. So essentially you define a message listener. In the past, you had to implement interface that will have method listen, and in this case, the framework will take care of this. This functionality still exists, but it's not necessarily useful anymore because there is annotations that allows you to put annotation to any interface. So the concept of this like a messaging will not have direct connection to Kafka API. So that's why the layer of message-driven POJO support can be implemented as something that is abstracted out, and only particular implementation will fill up the blanks and put the integration with Kafka, with a Kafka consumer API. So by default, this message-driven POJOs don't depend on underlying technology. You are not putting any Kafka related code in your POJO. You can just have one method that will have one input parameter. This input parameter will come from somewhere, from something that will invoke this method. And that also brings a very good opportunity to use annotation here. So if you annotate this method, so the Spring will take care of instantiating underlying containers that will be running Kafka consumers, reading messages from Kafka topic, handling serialization, and only after injecting right value in your application code. All these things would be managed by Spring, so you as a developer, as always, need to focus only on actual implementation. So Kafka Listener allows to receive messages, and it will instantiate a facility called message listener container. So this container will be handling parallelization, configuration, retries, different things that maybe Kafka application will require, things like do I need to commit my offset automatically, or I need to commit my offsets manually, and all that kind of stuff. The annotation brings the simplicity for the code. You don't need to extend any interfaces, so your POJO will just stick to your business logic. It would be much easier to test. You will not have a dependency on any framework things, so it would be much cleaner code. And the annotation will be just indication for Spring Framework that the code, actual, the underlying communication will be dedicated to specific listener. It is much easier to demonstrate how this thing works together. So that's why in the next exercise I will walk you through the process how you can create your message-driven Pojo, annotate this Kafka listener, and start receiving messages from Kafka topics in Confluent Cloud.